Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and I have a handwork project to share with you today. We are going to be making this multicolored knitted ball, and I just showed you one that had 4 colors and then this one has 6 colors. You also need some wool for filling and of course your knitting needles and a variety of colors for this ball. Of course you could just use the one color if you want, but this is a really exciting process to see those colors come together. I'm going to show you this in detail. The first thing you want to do is cast on, and I know there are many different ways to cast on and to knit, but I'm just going to show you the one that we are most familiar with these days. So we're just going to make that little slip knot there and put it onto our knitting needle, and then you want to grab the yarn between your fingers and pull down the knitting needle into a V. So I'm going to show you this again. You slip your 2 fingers in between those 2 strands of yarn, pull down the knitting needle, and then you can begin casting on. Now I'm going to show you this a couple of times so that you can really see the process. So again, I am just going to grab the yarn from my thumb and then wrap it around the yarn that is on my finger. Then I'm just going to reposition and then do the whole thing over again. Now for this ball, you can use anywhere from 18 to 20 cast on stitches, and I am using a bulky weight yarn for almost the entire ball, but I kind of made a mistake and one of the yarns is actually a worsted weight, so it's best if you try to use the same weight for the entire thing. So there I am, just counting up to make sure that I have the number that I need, and now we're going to begin knitting. And the way that I'm going to knit is going to require some cross-body action, which is especially good for these young developing students because it helps with brain development. So I am going to take my needle and I am going to, let's get that little piece of strand of yarn out of the way first. And you want to make sure that you're not knitting that little piece of strand of yarn. You want to make sure that you're actually knitting the yarn in your skein of yarn. So let me show you this process again. So I'm going to take my needle that is in my right hand, and I'm going to slip the needle through that loop that's on the needle in the left hand. And then you want to wrap your yarn around and then slip your needle through. I know it takes a little bit of practice, and in general, knitting is taught to first grade students in a Waldorf school, so about 7 years old. And I noticed that with my children, 7 was a little bit young. Even though they could learn how to do it at 7, I found that just because of the commitment of homeschooling multiple age students, I wasn't able to really spend the time with my 7-year-olds, and I found that they took on this skill much easier when they were just a little bit older. So I would call this project still a beginner project since it just requires basic knitting. Now once you're done knitting 1 or 2 strands, you want to make sure that you have the correct number of stitches. And for the first part of this, you want to knit 6 ridges, so that's about 12 rows. And once you get through knitting your 6 ridges, which you can see a little bit more clearly here, and using a bulky weight yarn helps this process along because it's a bulkier weight, so you can get through what appears to be more with not as much effort as if you were using a really thin worsted weight yarn or a very tightly plied yarn. Alright, so here comes the fun part, and that is stitching these 2 different colors together. Now you do not need to knot these at all, but you might consider making the blue yarn a little bit longer, and you'll see why at the end. But if your student is a little bit unsure of this process, then go ahead and knot those 2 yarns together, and that way it's a little bit easier to knit the first stitches. So you're going to go ahead and knit this the same way you did with just the single color, but now we are just stitching in the blue into that purple, which is going to look really cool. And you're still going to have that tail of that purple and the tail of the blue, and you're going to be able to see a little bit more clearly in just a minute. So that's how you get the second color onto your project. And when you knit the next row, it's going to be a lot easier because by that point your yarn is really well stitched in with the previous color. Now, I did this project with my 11-year-old, but I think that this would work with any child above 7 who has grasped the concept and the skill of knitting. So you can see by the time I got done with my second row that that little tail of blue was just a little bit too short, so I would recommend making it a little bit longer so that your student isn't nervous that it's going to come undone. And something else you can do is just go ahead and tie those two pieces together, and it's an option, you don't have to, it's fine in the end, it's not going to show anyway. Alright, so this is what it looks like when all 6 colors are knitted together. Now this is the one that my son did, and you can see that there's little bits of tail here and there of those extra pieces of yarn, and none of that's going to show, it's all going to be tucked inside the ball. So for this next process, you need a needle that has a wide eye so that it can fit your yarn, and this is a blunt needle, so it's safe for children and it's great for knitting projects. So now we want to tie off our yarn, and I did this with just a single strand of yarn, but in the past I have doubled up my yarn, and I think it's probably better to do double just so that it doesn't come undone or tear, because this is going to get played with children. Alright, so I'm just going to trim off that extra piece there, and then we're going to start turning this rectangle into a ball. It is really thrilling for children to see this. So you're just going to take your needle and just go along the top part of your project, and once I got through about 2 colors I was able to pull my needle through, and then I handed it over to my son to continue just knitting through, or actually sewing through the top portion of his project along with that yarn. And we're going to be pulling that yarn together to squeeze all of those top parts together. So now he's gotten just towards the end, and now this is where it's going to take a little bit of being careful so that you don't tug your yarn too hard and tear it. And this is why maybe doing 2 pieces of yarn through that, if you doubled up rather than going single, would make it a little bit safer for it to stay together, because it would be terrible if it came apart, but they're actually really easy to mend if they do. One of mine did come apart one time and it was very easy to fix. Alright, so now we have all of those pieces kind of pinched together, and you want to just take all those little extra bits of yarn and just make sure that they're on the inside. So you really don't need to trim them down. I actually trimmed down all those little extra pieces, and actually it's a little bit easier to keep them long because then they really do stick inside your whole project. So now I'm going to stitch those 2 ends together, and I am going to tie it off so that I ensure that it stays like that as I stitch down the side of the ball. So you can start to see that it's coming together like a ball. And now we're going to go and stitch that purple and blue together. You could do any color you wanted to. You could do 4 colors, you could do more colors. You just want to make sure that each color section is roughly the same size. And I mean, you could get creative and do them all different sizes as well. But you do want to be able to turn this into a ball in the end, and ours was a little bit of an oval shaped ball, but I think if we had stuffed it more it would have looked a little bit more circular. But in the end, it really doesn't matter. This is a very forgiving project, and my son absolutely loves it. There is like this excitement when the project is completed, and it's a really great, simple, easy project to do with any child, I would say about 8 and older. So once you get your yarn around the top part, so this is similar to how we began the project once we were done knitting it, then you can start to fill it up. So I wanted to go ahead and get that needle all the way through to the end, and I kind of pinched it just a little bit so it's not a full opening, but it's completely enough to start stuffing it. We're using some all-natural wool bat in order to stuff it, but you could use any kind of filler if you wanted to. And once you get it as full as you want it, then we can start to pinch those pieces together very carefully so that you don't tear anything. And then you just want to make sure that you tie it off and knot it so that it stays in place. And I'm just making sure that it's nice and squeezed together, and you can see how it completely turns into a ball. You did not have to do any kind of special stitching and reduce the stitches up to the corner. And that's what's really great about a project like this, is that you can do this as a beginner with a really simple rectangular shaped piece of knitting. So there it is, it's all done. It looks beautiful. I love the rainbow colors. My son really likes it, and now I'm working on another one for my daughter because she's only 6 and she's just a little bit too young for this yet, even though she's just itching to get her hands on a pair of needles. Alright, so if you want to see some of the other handwork projects that we have, you can tap on the screen right now. If you want to see some of the other projects that we're doing in our homeschool, I've left a couple more videos that might interest you. And don't forget that if you want to see what we're up to on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram at Pepper and Pine.